just an example of one particular work, just give you an idea of the sort of worker. It's a Vietnamese woman who arrived in Australia and lived in a camp in Malaysia a number of years before, arrived as a refugee. She was 15 or 16 when she arrived. She then went to the school system in Australia, but she was 16 or 17 at the time, and she was put in year 9, and everyone else of the same age was in year 12 or something. So she did, in other words, she hadn't had an exposure to English language learning environment prior to, and she hadn't spent long in the formal education system. So typical of these workers, she didn't have much of a formal education, and she likely had spoken proficiency issues as well. But for her, it wasn't an issue. We asked her if reading was difficult for her, and she said, "Oh no, everything, the word they use, it's easy." And we said, "Well, look, you know, it's not your first language." She said, "Look, I just pick it up, yes. If I cannot understand, I come and ask the team leader and say, what the meaning of this? Sometimes they use the meaning I understand. If I don't understand, I ask someone. I go ask someone." Not such a major issue for her. And yet she was doing work, she was a modeller. She was doing quite a sophisticated work. Now, from a numeracy perspective, and I'm not going to say much about this because I'm not a numeracy expert, but looking at that work that the modelers did, there are a few explicit operations with number work involved in that. And yet, in the computer system, there was a lot of maths going on for those sorts of calculations, for the people to do that work. And there was probably, in the modeller's head, deciding what to shave off and how to shape that hearing aid. There were things happening that involved maths, but they weren't visible. And this kind of activity has been termed techno mathematical literacies. But you'll have to ask Diana Coben what that might mean in more detail, because maths isn't really my area. But the point really is that the numeracy wasn't up front, it wasn't really visible, even though it was actually there. The implications for all this really, on the basis of this one company that we're working with, going back to the beginning when I mentioned, look, that quote from Fenwick, the conventional way of talking about language literacy and numeracy in the workplace is that it's deficit-oriented, individualist and universalist. We might ask ourselves, based on this company, is it necessary to formally assess and thus identify as deficient the language literacy and numeracy levels of workers in programs, where the whole idea is to improve their workplace practices? Now, I'm not saying this applies to every single company. I'm talking about this one company that we had. I think it's for us maybe to consider in a more generic sense that kind of issue. That's the deficit-oriented issue that we're contested. Should the primary focus be on the skills of individual workers, given that in this particular company it was the collective nature of the teamwork that really mattered? People work together. I'm sure that in this particular company, how people related to the fellow members in their team was probably more important than the individual bag of skills that they might have in terms of language literacy and numeracy. So that's the individualist issue. And the universalist, should we apply a universal and formal set of language literacy and numeracy skills, a generic set of skills, to assess and teach workers when these skills may not be clearly identifiable, and in fact, in the case of the modelers, they're invisible. So should we be focusing on these generic set of skills when, in this particular workplace context, you couldn't see those skills at all? They weren't apparent. And in terms of implications for partnerships, how should language literacy and numeracy providers approach workplace LLN issues? How should you do it? How should you gather the information? Who should you talk to in doing those sorts of partnerships? And what should the role of the language literacy and numeracy practitioner be? Is it just to fix up those generic LLN skills or more, given the example of this particular company? And what type of relationship should that LLN provider have with the company? Should they be a separate LLN expert? Should they be right in there as part of the company? And where should the training take place? Should it be in a a separate training room? Should it be there on the site? So they're the kind of issues to kind of ponder. And I did actually find one study, one New Zealand study that Catherine Kell and associates in one of the upskilling documents on in-house literacy and numeracy. There's a little quote there that pretty much resonates with, I think, what I'm saying. That we're talking here about a widening of perspectives of language literacy and numeracy beyond foundation skills. The intention will be to stress LLN not as something acquired by individuals prior to or separate from work, but as literacies that are themselves work. So it's a whole of organisation approach, and that work should be seen as textually mediated social practice, and the workplace as a learning environment. I think this particular company I was looking at, it was a learning environment, even though they didn't recognise it as that. It was just the way that they did things. I will finish there. And there's some of the references. I'm quite happy to provide any additional references or advice to anyone that want to contact me. I think we'll leave it there. Thanks.